Judge Grayson assumed he was dealing with just another clueless teenager, until the young man began to unravel the case like a seasoned attorney. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse grew heavy, nearly stifling. The gallery was packed, spectators murmuring as the drama unfolded. At the defense table, the young man seemed dwarfed by the furniture, his posture calm, hands in his pockets, chin tilted high enough to show he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, 19 years old. Charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The allegations were serious, but Judge Walter Grayson's gaze made one thing clear. This trial wasn't just about the charges. It was personal. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily on the polished wood of his bench. He peered over his glasses at Jalen, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Think you're some kind of legal expert?" he asked, voice laced with dry amusement. "This isn't debate club, kid." A few quiet chuckles echoed around the room, from the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. Everyone seemed to be in on the joke, everyone except Jalen. He didn't flinch, didn't smile. He'd been preparing for a moment like this for years. Not exactly this moment, but close. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen studied case law. While his friends played video games, he staged courtroom battles in his mind. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades, filling their home with stories of courtroom politics, cut corners, biased judges, indifferent defense attorneys. Jalen had soaked it all in. By the age of 14, he could deconstruct a trial better than most first-year law students, but none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another troubled kid wasting his time. "Let's keep this short," the judge said, flipping open the case file. "I've got a tea time at 2. The courtroom chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Jalen allowed himself the slightest, almost invisible smirk, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. The rest of the room hadn't noticed. Not yet. As prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood, the game truly began. Certainly, here's a rephrased version of the paragraph that retains its tone, rhythm, and dramatic tension. He spoke with the calm assurance of a man who believed the verdict was already written. His suit was immaculate, his tie flawlessly knotted, and his voice carried the polished rhythm of someone who had delivered the same argument 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, "the state will show, beyond any reasonable doubt, that..." The defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in the act. The vehicle in question, a 2022 Audi A6, had been reported stolen just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued the defendant through downtown Los Angeles, where he allegedly tried to evade capture before being apprehended. His fingerprints were discovered on the steering wheel. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "The evidence," he said with finality, "speaks for itself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. To the average ear, the story sounded airtight. Stolen vehicle, high-speed chase, attempted escape. It all painted a clear picture. Judge Grayson cast a quick glance at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then nodded at the prosecutor to continue. Carrington stepped toward the jury box, each step punctuated by the sharp click of his polished shoes against the courtroom floor. "The defense may try to paint this as a misunderstanding. They might suggest that Mr. Dawson is merely the victim of unfortunate circumstances." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. How many victims run from the police?" The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin in one hand, studying the young man before him. Jalen didn't flinch. Carrington continued, shuffling through his documents. "Your Honor, I have here the sworn statement of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally observed the defendant behind the wheel prior to the pursuit. The vehicle was confirmed stolen, and the arrest was executed by the book." Judge Grayson let out a low breath through his nose and gave a slow nod. Sounds pretty straightforward to me. To most in the courtroom, the case seemed open and shut. A stolen car, a police chase, an arrest. The narrative was clean, straightforward, but not to Jalen. He had studied too many trials, dissected too many case files to miss the inconsistencies lurking beneath the surface. Still, he held his tongue, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson gave, his gavel a light tap. "All right, let's hear from the defense." He turned toward Lisa Thornton, the court-appointed public defender who had spoken barely a handful of words since the proceedings began. She stood, visibly uneasy. "Your Honor, my client..." Jalen gently placed a hand on her arm, stopping her mid-sentence. It was a quiet gesture, but it carried weight. She hesitated, then slowly sat back down, and for the first time, Jalen addressed the court. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room fell into stunned silence. Grayson blinked at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was steady, deliberate. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur swept through the gallery. The bailiff raised his eyebrows. Carrington's confident smirk flickered just for a second before he gave a short, mocking laugh. Well, this should be interesting. But the laughter faded quickly, because as Jalen stepped forward, everything in the room shifted. The energy changed. The courtroom, once heavy with routine, now held its breath. Jalen stood tall, hands still in his pockets, and let the silence hang just a moment longer, long enough to unsettle them. Then he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin my defense, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Carrington narrowed his eyes, arms folded. "Go ahead." Jalen stepped forward slowly, deliberately. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally observed me behind the wheel of the vehicle before I was apprehended. Is that correct?" Carrington let out a short breath, the first hint of tension breaking through. "That's right," Carrington replied, already sounding slightly impatient. "And that detail is in Officer Ruiz's official report." "Of course it is," Jalen said with a nod, then turned toward Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony stricken from the record." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and motioned toward the prosecution's table, because Officer Ruiz never actually saw me in that car. In fact, Jalen paused for effect. He wasn't even on duty when the pursuit started. A flicker of confusion passed over Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another measured step forward. "Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to formally request access to Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from the night in question. If his report states he saw me in the vehicle, then his location data should support that." He paused, letting the weight of the next word linger, but "I have reason to believe it won't." The murmuring in the gallery grew louder. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. Judge Grayson's frown deepened as he glanced over at Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw visibly tense. "Your Honor, this report was filed by a sworn officer of the law. Are we seriously entertaining the idea that the word of a defendant should override that of a trained professional?" Jalen gave a subtle shrug, calm and composed. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will confirm it. But if he wasn't..." He let the sentence drift off, the silence finishing it for him. Judge Grayson stared at Jalen for a long beat, then shifted his attention back to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS data?" Carrington hesitated. It was only a moment, but in that moment, the courtroom caught it. The jury saw, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, so did the judge. Jalen inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He'd spent years analyzing trials, watching prosecutors maneuver, manipulate, misdirect. He knew every trick in their playbook, and one thing was always true. If Carrington truly believed his case was airtight, he wouldn't be hesitating. He wouldn't be stalling if he had nothing to hide. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the damage was already done. The courtroom, once buzzing with quiet amusement, had gone still. The silence was thick, humming with a new tension. No one was laughing anymore. Carrington glanced down, shuffling his papers, his earlier confidence beginning to fray. "Your Honor," he said, trying to recover, "while we wait on those GPS records, one fact remains. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "That's true," he said, stepping forward. "But let's take a closer look at that piece of evidence." Grayson raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to proceed. Jalen turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. His voice stayed even, calm. "The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were found in the car, that's proof I stole it. That's the story they're selling." He paused, letting the idea land before continuing. "But let's think logically for a moment. Say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You slip your hands into the pockets, maybe zip it up, then decide not to buy it. You hang it back up and leave." He took a breath, steady and measured. "Later that day, someone shoplifts that exact same jacket. Should your fingerprints on it automatically make you the thief?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery whispered something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to dwell. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before it was reported stolen. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door. It was already unlocked." He paused, voice still composed. "I didn't think much of it. I didn't drive off in it. I didn't steal anything. It was a dumb, impulsive moment. Curiosity, nothing more." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, just long enough to make them settle. Then, in a voice that sliced through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes in a frantic attempt to find something, anything, that might help him regain control. But Jalen wasn't done. "And while we're on the subject," he said, turning to Judge Grayson, "let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted." He paused. "Your Honor, was the forensic analyst who worked this case subpoenaed to testify today?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard. He turned to Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated before answering, then finally admitted, "No." Jalen pressed his lips together, nodding slightly. "So let me get this straight. The state is leaning on forensic evidence to convict me, fingerprints on a steering wheel, but they didn't think it was necessary to have the actual specialist here to testify? No opportunity for me to cross-examine, no questions about chain of custody, no scrutiny of the lab methods used?" Carrington's jaw clenched. Jalen nodded again, like he'd just confirmed a suspicion. "Interesting." Judge Grayson let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing that the case in front of him was not the simple conviction he had expected. But Jalen still wasn't finished, because what he was about to say next would shift the entire trajectory of the trial. He stepped forward again, voice calm but deliberate. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Grayson frowned. "The owner?" "Yes," Jalen said. "Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Audi in question, gave a statement to the police that somehow was never included in the prosecution's filings." He turned slowly to face Carrington, "And I think I know why. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told the officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Jalen asked, his gaze fixed on Carrington. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he calmly pulled a printed document from his folder, holding it up. "This is a transcript from the original police report," he said, then read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Jalen raised the paper for all to see. "This is from the very same report the prosecution chose not to include in their filings." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer left this detail out of his testimony. The prosecution ignored it entirely, and yet they're asking this jury to believe, without question, that I'm guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." He looked pointedly at Carrington, who quickly stepped forward, grasping for control. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant," he said. "The defendant was found in possession of the stolen vehicle." "No," Jalen cut in, his tone steady and firm. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words landed with precision. "I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't caught driving it or fleeing from it. I was arrested several blocks away, walking home with snacks after hanging out with my friends." He let the truth settle over the room before continuing. "The only thing connecting me to this car is sloppy police work and a set of assumptions." Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, his fingers pressed to his temple. The case was coming apart, at the seams, and everyone in the room could feel it. Jalen turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night, but the officers found a black kid in the area and decided that was close enough. He let that sentence hang in the silence that followed. No noise, no movement, just the weight of uncomfortable truth filling the courtroom. Judge Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington stood stiffly, his face flushed with frustration and defeat. "No, Your Honor." Grayson let out a long breath. His gaze lingered on Jalen, steady and unreadable, then shifted to the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and delivered the words that would echo long after everyone left the room. "Case dismissed." For a moment, silence. Then the courtroom exploded. Gasps, whispers, scattered shouts. Half the room buzzed with disbelief, the other half with quiet relief. In the gallery, reporters began scribbling furiously, fingers flying over notepads. Jalen remained still. He let the moment hang, let the weight of it land. The dismissal wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. Judge Grayson, still holding his gavel, stared at Jalen. There was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there earlier. Recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen met the judge's gaze, then turned and began walking toward the doors. But just as he reached them, Grayson spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Jalen paused but didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated, then said quietly, "You should think about law school." Jalen allowed himself a small smirk. He didn't need to. Think about it. He was already headed there. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with noise. Reporters packed the walkway, cameras flashing, microphones extending toward him like weapons. "Jalen, did you know the judge would throw out the case? What's your next move? How does it feel to outsmart a veteran prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie up and kept moving, ignoring the questions. The spotlight didn't interest him. This wasn't about showing off. It never had been. It was about something much deeper at nay. The bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Denise, stood waiting, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him, silent. Then finally, she exhaled and shook her head. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a chance, Ma." She stared at him a moment longer, then pulled him into a fierce hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, reporters still calling out his name. But Jalen didn't notice anymore. His focus had shifted. Across the street, leaning against his car, Judge Grayson watched. His stance had changed. No more arrogance, no hint of amusement. Something deeper had settled into his expression, something that looked a lot like reflection. He hadn't expected this case to mean anything. Just another file, another defendant, another routine guilty plea. But now he knew. He'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done what few ever could. He held a mirror up to the system, and for once, the system blinked. Here's the truth we need to sit with. How many cases like this have slipped by unnoticed? How many people have been convicted not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a justice system more concerned with closure than with truth? Jalen had the tools to fight back. But what about those who don't? This wasn't just about one trial. This was about all the people who never got a fair shot. And Jalen understood now. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. Next time, he wouldn't be the one on trial. He'd be the one arguing the case. And he wouldn't be alone. If this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, then don't let it end here.